Conversation with Hal Bruno as we look at 1968 all this week at the changes and the impact that it had on our country. And of course, it was a year in which there was a presidential election. And joining us on the phone is former South Dakota Senator George McGovern. Senator, thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
Senator, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Senator, as you look back at 1968, a lot of changes and a big impact on American politics. What do you remember?
Well, I remember the changes that were ordered in 1968 after the Democratic Committee and the Democratic Convention virtually fell apart in Chicago. That convention excluded millions of people who didn't even know what the process was for selecting delegates. And in many cases, states were sending delegations to Chicago without any women, or maybe one or two. In some cases where black people represented 15 or 20% of the population of the state, there was only a token black. There were no young people under 30 in many of those delegations. So the 68 convention voted overwhelmingly to create a reform committee that I was asked to chair. And we came out with a new set of rules that we've operated on ever since. And I think they're working very well.
Why, Senator, do you think the convention in 1968 proved to be so tumultuous for Hubert Humphrey and the Democrats in Chicago?
Well, the transcendent issue before the country in 1968 was the war in Vietnam. That war had become so controversial that Lyndon Johnson, who had won in a landslide in '64, decided not to run for re-election. And so you had other candidates coming forward, but we hadn't yet reformed our delegate selection process, as I said, and therefore you had thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people out in the street who had been protesting against the war in Vietnam who couldn't get inside the convention hall. And it was that frustration and resentment that provoked the clash of many of those people with the Chicago police. I never really condemned the police in those incidents because those policemen were young people too, for the most part. They were frightened by the size of the crowds in the street that were protesting, just as the people doing the protesting were afraid of the police. And when you have fear on both sides, you have trouble. And so that's what happened in Chicago. Unfortunately, the whole nation saw that, and some observers believe that that cost our candidate, Hubert Humphrey, who was a brilliant man, that it cost him the election against Nixon that fall.
And Senator, as you stay with us, we want to welcome Hal Bruno, longtime political analyst and former political director at ABC News. You were at the convention in 1968. Good morning to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Senator. Good to be with you.
You too, Hal. You've always been one that I admired more than I can tell you.
I appreciate that.
And you were hearing the Senator's comments on the convention in Chicago. What are your thoughts?
Well, let me fill you in real quick with some background. I'm a Chicagoan. I was a Chicago police reporter and worked on a Chicago newspaper for 7 years. At the time of the convention, I was the news editor of Newsweek. So I saw the convention on the street and I saw it in the convention hall. I think what happened in Chicago was inevitable. The anti-war movement had been building up steam. It was seeking a confrontation. Some were seeking martyrdom so they could help recruit on the college campuses when they went back in the fall. On the city side, I'm not as charitable as Senator McGovern was. Mayor Daley and the city government were determined that they were going to do whatever was necessary to stifle dissent and to give them the confrontation that they were seeking. And they proceeded to do that. And what went wrong in Chicago is that hundreds of people did things for which they deserved to be arrested. But instead of being arrested, they were beaten up. And I saw, personally, I saw many of them beaten up after they had been subdued, when they were being held on the ground by policemen. I had no personal sympathy with the anti-war movement. And as I say, they did things for which they deserved to be arrested, but they weren't arrested, they were beaten up, and that's what went wrong.
Senator McGovern, let me ask you one of the what-ifs of 1968 with the reference on Friday by Senator Clinton to Senator Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated 40 years ago next month. Had he lived, do you think he would have been the Democratic nominee in 1968?
No, I don't think so, because Hubert Humphrey, who was then the vice president, had too many delegates locked up before Bob Kennedy even got into the race. I was a close friend of Robert Kennedy, and after he was killed, his delegates urged me to take his place at the convention. I had to actually announce for president in order to do that. So I had lots of deep feeling at that time. I had lived next door to Hubert Humphrey in Chevy Chase for 12 years. He grew up in South Dakota just as I did before he went to Minnesota. So I had friendships there that cut across my political preference line. I want to say I don't disagree with the thing that Hal Bruno said. There's no question some of those police got out of hand, and I also saw some of the beatings that took place. There's no excuse for that, but I think in many cases they saw the demonstrators as the enemy that had to be subdued, and it turned into what was then called a police riot, and I suppose that's a justified name.
Finally, Senator, what are the lessons from 1968 in terms of conventions, presidential politics, and the Democratic Party?
The lessons were learned in '68, and the party, with all of the Humphrey delegates, the McCarthy delegates, the Kennedy delegates, which I then patrolled at the convention, all of us recognized we had to do something about the process by which delegates were selected. You had to have some reasonable relationship to the population. If roughly half the people of the state were men and half women, then the delegation didn't need to reflect that absolutely on a percentage basis, but some reasonable relationship, which we didn't have at that '68 convention. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get wiser delegates under the new rules. It just means that the process would be open to everybody, every registered Democrat.
Senator, you supported Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination, but have since said that you are going to vote for and support Senator Obama. Have you had a conversation since that time with Senator Clinton?
Oh, yes. I talked to all parties concerned before I said anything publicly, and I still remain friends of President Clinton and Senator Clinton. But when I endorsed Hillary on October 6th last year, I had never met Barack Obama. I heard that he was a brilliant man, but I'd never met him. But as I watched that campaign unfold, it seemed to me that he was the one that had taught the spirit of the country, the need for change, the need to lay aside some of the old political practices, and to give the country, in a sense, a new leadership and a new day. So I decided a couple of weeks ago to switch what little support I have, if any, to Mr. Barack Obama.
George McGovern joining us from his home state in South Dakota. Senator, thanks as always for being with us. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure to be with you.
Hal Bruno, as you look back at 1968, what are the lessons?
1968 has to be one of the worst years this country ever experienced, from start to finish. The lessons of 1968 are still with us. First of all, when you have two sides seeking confrontation, you're going to wind up having a confrontation. And it's very difficult